Hello and welcome to Mothman's Bookshop. My name is Nicole, and today I'd like to tell you about Jane Steele by Lindsay Fay. Warning, I'll try and make this as spoiler-free as possible, but given it's a book review, there are bound to be a couple spoilers. This book. Oh, the things I want to say about this book, and I will say them because this is my podcast and I write the scripts. Jane Steele is a more murderous retelling of Jane Eyre, written by Lindsay Fay and published in 2016. It's an amazing story about guilt and redemption, secret pasts that actually have an effect on the present and future. It's definitely a bold book, and though it was published pretty recently, I think Fay perfectly imitates the writing style of books from the Romantic and early Gothic era, aka the 1840s and 50s, by using idioms and slang they would have used back then. I'm adding a content warning here for mentions of sexual assault, murder, and suicide. This book starts out in the outskirts of London, where Jane Steele and her mother Anne-Laure Steele, a widowed French dancer, live in a cottage on the grounds of Highgate House. The estate itself belonged to Jane's deceased father, Jonathan Steele, an Englishman who worked in Paris as a banker, where he subsequently met Jane's mother. While the Steeles live in the cottage, the main house is occupied by Jane's aunt Patience Barbery and her 13-year-old son Edwin, a disgusting pervert. Despite these living circumstances, Jane is assured time and time again by her mother that the house and everything around it belong to her and that she will inherit it once she's of age. Though there are occasional conflicts and arguments between the two families, they live in relative peace until one fateful day, Anne-Laure Steele kills herself. After preventing Jane from attending the funeral, Aunt Patience wastes no time in trying to send her away to Lowen Bridge School, a boarding school meant to mold difficult little girls into the perfect wives and governesses. As she runs away, disgusting little Edwin, who has already exposed himself to her once before, chases after her and attempts to sexually assault her in the woods. After barely fending him off by rolling down a hill, Jane angrily pushes him into a ravine, effectively murdering him and not being too disturbed by the act. Fearing discovery, Jane asks to be sent away to Lowen Bridge, where she meets some friends and horrible headmaster Vesalius Mund, who has a tendency to assault teachers and starve and horribly punish students for the smallest things, such as being late to a class. As she travels from place to place in London, leaving a trail of bodies in her wake, she stumbles upon an advert from Highgate House, where one Charles Thornfield is looking for a governess for his ward. This thoroughly shocks Jane, and she sets off to find out whether or not the estate truly belongs to her. She arrives under the guise of a governess to a fully Sikh household and an adorable half-Indian, half-English girl named Sajara, her employer's ward. What she doesn't expect to find is the Highgate House ensnared in a web woven from dark secrets and hidden pasts. Now, onto the review. Jane Steele is incredible, and I mean both the book and the character. The book overall is so incredibly interesting. The story is both twisted and straightforward. All the characters are so well fleshed out without there being too many details or being confusing. Jane herself is such an interested and twisted and charismatic character in person. Since the book is formatted like an autobiography, we really get to see Jane's inner thoughts and how she justifies certain actions. Her way of thinking is so unique, especially since she's a murderer, and seeing her interact with other characters, knowing her intentions and opinions, is quite different from other books I've read. Lindsay Fay made a very complex character, and I think the biggest example of this is Jane's lying. Jane lies for her own gain, but she also does it to protect others. Whenever she lied to her loved ones, we saw her intense inner turmoil over the fact that she can't tell the truth, but over the course of the book, she grows, and by the end, she's a fully formed three-dimensional character. This whole concept is done very well in my opinion. Volume 1 focuses mainly on Jane's backstory, her journey through Lowen Bridge, and the beginning of her time in London. Volume 2 specifically explores her time in London and the beginning of her time at Highgate House. And Volume 3 I think is the most important plot-wise because it contains the conflict and resolution part of the book. We find out early on that Jane's writing style and personality are heavily inspired by Jane Eyre, and she frequently refers to the book, especially towards the end, by using quotes from it to reflect on her life or seek advice from its characters. On the very first page, Jane says, "I have been reading over and over the most riveting book titled Jane Eyre, and the work inspires me to imitative acts." What I like a lot about Jane is that she isn't necessarily a villain, more so an anti-hero. All of her murders, 5 in all, are fully justified. For example, the first was out of self-defense when Edwin attempted to assault her, and the next was her evil headmaster who would abuse and assault both the teachers and the students. Something the author did that I just loved is she made Jane so much more than just an orphan or just a murderer. Jane is a strong woman who knows what she wants and needs, as well as how to get it. When she falls off a horse and mistakes Mr. Thornfield for an attacker, she's not afraid to start calling him names and brandishing her little tiny pocket knife in self-defense. She doesn't just go in with the goal of taking back her house, but she's actually ready to form connections and learn more about the household. She's respectful and curious about the Sikh religion, and treats the staff with dignity. Charles, Sardar, and Sajara are just such fascinating characters, and each have an incredibly interesting history, both individually and with each other. Sajara is the little girl Jane is meant to look after, and she's so adorable, but she also knows how to stand up for herself. On a personal note, I think her love of horses is adorable because I was also a big horse girl. I want to talk about the romance aspect now. If you listened to episode 2, my Truly Devious review, then you know how much the romance annoyed me. This book, however, is a complete 180 from that. The romance is integrated into the story carefully, and it doesn't drag on too much, and it's not its own subplot either, which is good. If Jane hadn't fallen in love, she likely wouldn't have been so ready to give her life to protect the home and those living in it. The romance is full of pining, and the way it's written had me reading and squealing because of how cute it was sometimes. The secrets on both sides were so well thought out and built up, and reading Jane's inner conflicts made it so interesting to follow. Overall, the entire romance aspect was really well done, and the way it tied into the end was so good and so wholesome. I have been raving about how great this book is the whole time, but something that I think could have been a bit better is the exposition. There are a couple moments in the book where a character explains why someone is coming after them, or why someone is looking for a lost trunk, and that's when a lot of names and locations are thrown around, and it gets a bit confusing at times. It was interesting to read, but the sheer amount of characters and what the relationship was to another was a bit overwhelming. I think the book would do better without one or two of the people mentioned, because there are two characters that are super similar and could just be merged into one. Final thoughts? This is an incredible novel. The writing had me wrapped around its pinky, and there was nothing I could do about it. The style is so unique, and I'm not sure I've ever read anything quite like it. I definitely want to read Faye's other book, titled The Paragon Hotel. I think it's written in the same sort of autobiographical style. Most platforms rate Jane Steele around 4 out of 5 stars. I rated a solid 5 out of 5. That's the first 5 of this podcast. Let's get into the questions. Our first question comes from one of my teachers, who asked, "What's something that annoyed you while you were reading it?" I can't say that anything really annoyed me while I was reading it. It was a little slow sometimes, but compared to the pace of the rest of the book, I'm not complaining. Maybe one thing is the headmaster. That guy just made me really angry because of how awful he is. Okay, and our next question is from the one and the only Foggy D, and he asks, "Are you into murder mysteries in general?" I think I am, yes. I thought this would be a murder mystery, but I wasn't disappointed when I found out it wasn't. The next book I'm reviewing is a horror book, but the one after that is murder mystery, so I'm excited for both of those. Thank you all for listening to the 3rd episode of Mothman's Bookshop. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Next week, I'm reviewing a horror book, and let me tell you right now, it is absolutely absurd, yet philosophical. If you would like to ask a question or recommend something, I've linked a form in the description. And if you want to know when a new episode comes out, do yourself a favor and follow the podcast. Once again, I'm your host Nicole, and I'll see you next week here in Mothman's Bookshop.